All right, let's go. First cast. My brother caught a close to 3-pounder on his first cast. Are you serious? Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to continue our step-by-step fishing lessons. This time we're going to jump into the world of soft plastics. Now, if you're brand new to bass fishing or just fishing altogether, I encourage you to go back and watch my playlist called Fishing Lessons Step by Step. Those videos will walk you through the ins and out of setting up a spin caster rod or even a spinning reel, showing you how to catch your first fish. After that, watch the first bass fishing video where I talk about your cast and retrieve lures just to get you started. Things like a spinnerbait, buzzbait, and even my beloved chatterbait. I also have a playlist for fishing knots to show you step by step how to tie them, or to serve as a refresher course for later on down the road. Now, there are a lot of soft plastics out there on the market today, and I mean hundreds of different options. So we're gonna break this series down into 3 different videos to show you all the various ways to rig up your different plastics for when you go out fishing. In this video, we're going to talk about the Texas rig, the 3 different type of Texas rigs, and the way that I like to fish it. So how did we get where we are today, where there are hundreds and hundreds of different options of soft plastics to choose from? Well, it all started back in 1949 with Nick Cream, when he created the first plastic worm. He loved fishing for bass with night crawlers, but could never seem to find enough, or whenever the bite was getting good, he ran out. So he wanted to have some kind of artificial way to be able to fish with his favorite worm. Now, Nick was a machinist by trade, living up in Ohio. And he had an idea to create an artificial worm, so he talked to some friends at DuPont who showed him various different plastics that he could mix up at home and pour his own different worms, and that's exactly what he did. Once he got the method down and was able to recreate and had success catching fish on them, he actually started selling them out of his house. Eventually, the operation got big enough that he ran into business for himself, moved to Texas, and cream worms became a thing. Now, over time, the cream worm became a thing. They ended up renaming it the Scoundrel, pre-rigged it with a couple of hooks and a little spinner out the front, and it started selling out. Now, along the same time in the early 50s, there was a lake being built. So they had cleared out all the timber, dropped the trees, and started flooding the area to create this lake. The Scoundrel had become real popular with bass fishermen. But there's an amateur angler, and I guess nobody knows his name, really liked the cream worm, but every time he would fish this new lake, the worm would get stuck in the brush piles. So he wanted to come up with some way to fish it weedless. So what he did was he took a bell sinker, he clipped off the brass holder at the top, slid that up the line, then took one of the cream replacement worms, put it on a hook, then turned the hook to basically make it weedless. And the Texas rig was born. So that leads us to the next question. What is a Texas rig? Well, it's simple. It's a hook, a line, a slip sinker, and your bait, or in this case, a 10-inch Berkeley power worm. A bait that has caught me bass after bass after bass over the last 4 decades of bass fishing. So let's start with the very basics. For beginners, again, I recommend a spin casting rod or the good old trusty spinning rod. If you've been fishing a while and you've moved up to bait casters, everything we covered today will also apply. But to keep it simple for new anglers or those returning to the water after a long layoff, I'm going to keep it simple and start with this spinning rod from Abu Garcia, this Red Max that I picked up a couple of years ago. It's a 7-foot medium action rod that'll do everything we want to do to catch some bass. The fishing line that I recommend you start out with, that you can find at Walmart, Real King, or any sporting goods store around, Berkeley Trilene XL, the smooth casting 12-pound test monofilament. That will cover everything you want and need to do to use a spinning rod to catch largemouth bass. If you have the line and you have the rod and you don't know how to put the line on the spool, there's a video for that in the playlist. Now that we've got our rod, reel, and line ready to go, let's talk about the different components of a Texas rig and what we're going to do to get started. Hook, line, sinker, the basics you need for bass fishing. So let's talk about them. If you're just getting started and you don't have anything, you can start out with a kit like this that you can pick up at Walmart for like 10 bucks. This is going to have everything you need to cover all of the techniques we're going to talk about over these next 3 videos. If you're looking for more of an all-in-one, you can get a bundle like this. I think, again, at Walmart was less than 10 bucks. That's got some baits and hooks, and then all you would need is some weights. Or if you wanted to keep it at its absolute cheapest, you could pick up a pack of 3 or 4 aught size hooks. Yes, aught is how they size hooks. These are the basic worm hooks. And if you look even inside the little packet, it shows you how to do a Texas rig. Pick up a pack of little bullet sinkers, because they're shaped like bullets. And a pack of Berkeley Power Bait 7-inch Blue Fleck Power Worm. There's 10,000 other styles. These will catch you fish. Trust me. Now you may be saying, but Gramps, when I walk into the Walmart or the Dick's Sporting Goods or the Bass Pro Shop, I see walls and aisles and walls of soft plastics. Yep, you will hear me talking a lot of times about catching fish or fishermen, but don't get me wrong, I have a ton of soft plastics. Because sometimes if you're fishing in lakes or tournaments that are heavily pressured every day of the week, sometimes you might just have to find that one bait that a bass may not have seen in a while, or have ever seen, something that's a little bit different. But that's way down the road if you're a beginner. If you're just getting started, keep it simple. Something like some worms, or for clear water, chartreuse lizard, or something as simple as a stick bait, like the Yum Dinger or this Guggen Squad lunker log. Keep the colors simple, black and blue for stained water, or green pumpkin for clear water. But you can throw a black and blue fleck power worm like this in any color water and still catch fish. Start slow, start simple, then build up from there based on what the fish like in the places you fish. Every pond, every creek, every river, every lake is a little bit different. You just got to figure out a little bit what the fish like. Alright, so as we get started with the Texas rig, we're going to talk about a couple of different things. We're going to talk about 3 types of Texas rig. We'll start with the traditional Texas rig, which is the hook, the line, the sinker, and the bait. Then we'll talk about a pegged Texas rig, which is where we add a bobber stop to the line to keep the slip sinker from moving up and down the line. And then we'll talk about a weightless Texas rig, where we just use the hook and line and the bait without an actual weight. So when you hear somebody talk about Texas rig, what they probably normally mean is the hook, the line, the sinker. You'll hear people talk about weightless Texas rigs, take away the sinker, or pegged, meaning we added a bobber stop to the line to peg the sinker closer to the bait. We're going to go through and look at all 3 methods and then show some of the different soft plastics we use for each of those different methods. What we're also going to look at is 3 different types of hooks traditionally used with Texas rigs, and again, when we use those. So let's get into it. This is a traditional offset worm hook, and what they mean by offset is the offset between the eye of the hook and the point of the hook. So as you can see, the point is going along this plane, whereas the eye is going along this plane. They are offset. Now when I bring in this extra wide gap hook, you can see the extra wide gap between the point of the hook and down here, but it's pretty much along this. The point is basically pointing at the eye of the hook. They're along the same plane. We use these hooks for the baits that are a little thicker in plastic. The extra wide gap, which is why it's called that, allows for more room for baits that are much bigger. So if we take and look at this tube, you'll see how much bigger it is when compared to, this plastic worm right here. Then we have what we call a straight shank hook, and as you can see, the eye runs along its own line and the point of the hook runs along its own line. Now this one more or less goes into the bait like this, so that when I snap set the hook real hard, it will pivot and drive the bait up into the hook of the fish's mouth. I'll show you what I mean a little better when I add the weight to it. Now when we rig this extra wide gap hook up into the bait, it'll lay along the outside of the bait with the point pinched into the soft plastic. We call that Texposed, and I'll show you that here in a second. I just wanted to give you an idea from this perspective. Now when I rig on a traditional worm hook, I'll tie it on and put the hook in the plastic, but the hook won't run all the way through. It'll sit in the plastic just on the subsurface so that when I set the hook, it'll pop free and hit the fish in the mouth. So as we take a look at our 3 different hook types, the traditional offset worm hook, the extra wide gap, and then the straight shank, well, this is just an evolution over time in many years of fishing. We started with the worm hook, then we added the extra wide gap, And then we've kind of gone specialty with the straight shank when we're basically pitching and flipping these creature baits into, you know, thick cover laydowns and things like that. Now, do you need all three of these hooks to be able to Texas rig? Nope. If a person wanted to get started with fishing any of these different baits, I would just get a size 3 or 4 extra wide gap hook and be done with it. But sometimes you might run into these various hooks if you buy like a tackle pack, so I wanted to cover them all. But if you wanted one hook to get it all done, a size 3 or 4 extra wide gap hook would cover any and all of these baits. Now, Texas rigging is great for bank anglers, especially beginners using spinning rods, because it gives you so many different options. So when might you want to throw a weightless Texas rig? Well, if you're fishing in shallow water, you can take one of these stick baits and use this worm hook and cast it out and get a nice little twitching action in the water with the stick bait like this. Or you can take a bait like this Super Fluke, and I use an extra wide gap hook for this because, as you can see, the plastic is thicker in this bait, and you want this extra room for the plastic to be able to move down so that that hook can rise up into the fish's mouth. But again, this is one that you can throw on light line out into shallow water from the bank and just twitch the bait so it looks like a bait fish jumping around in the water. So when you're just getting started, you want to get an idea of how the hook and the bait are going to work together. So with this offset worm hook, as you can see, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and move the eye of the hook down just a little bit from the top because I want to bury that knot into the plastic. And as you can see here, this hook point is going to be just below the surface of this lunker log. So when the fish bites and I go to set the hook, I'm going to end up snapping my rod tip up, and it's going to pull this hook point out of the bait like this and into the fish's mouth. Eventually what will happen is this plastic will drop down like this, and this whole point will be in the top or the side of the fish's mouth, just like that. So straighten everything back out. I'm going to put the eye down here. I'm going to see that this hook is going to come through the bottom of the shank of the hook is right down here by this little sack. Pretty much all of your straight worms like this are going to have like a little sack that looks like an actual earthworm. So I know that, you know, generally that point's going to come out there somewhere. So what I want to do is I'm going to measure it up, and I'm going to come down just a little bit below. So what I normally do is I can see that the bend of this hook normally starts just about the place where I want to come out. So that's my reference point. So what I like to do is I will take this worm hook and I will come into the very center at the top of the worm and push it straight in until I start to get to the bend of that hook. Then I will take and poke the point out, pull it out just like that, and then take and rotate and push the hook down. So this little ledge here is what's going to keep, it's going to come out this side right here, and that's what's going to keep the worm from slipping down. So I'm going to pull this in, and then I'm going to start to rotate, and then I'll pull that little bend out. So as you can see right there, my knot is buried. The worm is sitting on the little ledge of the hook right there. My hook is just laying right along the edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and put my thumb right here at the bottom of this hook, and I'm going to take and I'm going to poke that point in right there and bring it up nice and straight. So I've run the point of that hook to the just subsurface of this hook. It's literally right there. If a fish hits this, it's going to push this worm down, expose that point, and drive it into the fish's mouth. So as you can see, the hook runs down along, comes out, and then the point just runs right through and is just below the surface. So what I can do is I can cast this out, let it sink a little bit, and then just twitch, work the rod tip, just twitch, and this thing will dodge and dart in the water. I actually caught a nice fish the other day while I was on the phone with my son. Let's take a quick look. Fish, yeah, it's crazy. There's just so much. Yo.
You wanna know my biggest accomplishment with all this just happened?
What's that? Oh, fish! Fish! Hold on, I got a fish. I got it.
Okay.
don't even know if I got a good hook in him or not, but I need to catch this motherfucker. Come here. Get in the net. Get in the net. Get in the net. No, get in the net. So it's funny, I managed to catch fish while on the phone with somebody. But I was throwing this in really clear water and just twitching it. Makes it look like a bluegill or something in the water to the bass. But this green pumpkin in the clear water works really well. And then in the next video, we'll get into some other weightless rigging methods. But for now, we're sticking with the Texas rig. All right, for another weightless Texas rig, we're going to use a Zoom Super Fluke. It's just meant to look like a dying bait fish in the water. So I'll throw this out weightless, let it sink a little bit, twitch, twitch, twitch. And the bass go nuts, especially in the early spring. So the extra wide gap hook here again, we use the extra wide gap because when the bass bites, it's going to pop this hook up like this. And we want as much, we want to clear as much of this plastic out of the way as we can to get this hook in the fish's mouth. Now if you're curious about what knots I use for this, if I'm using monofilament like I recommended, on your spinning rod, we'll use the polymer knot. You can watch this video right up here for how to tie these knots. If you're using fluorocarbon, I highly recommend the improved clinch knot. You can watch videos on how to tie those knots right up here. To rig up this fluke, we're going to do the same thing. Point in the middle of the bait, push it out, rotate, and pull it down. Now this one's got a little flap in here, so we can push the hook into here after measuring, push down, pinch it out, and then we're just barely going to skin hook that point into here to make this weedless. But as soon as that bass hits it, it's going to free itself like that. The hook's going to stick into the mouth. So again, we'll just skin hook it just like that. Throw that out there, give it some pops and twitches, you're going to catch some bass. Alright, so as you can see here, we've added a little slip sinker to the front of our stick bait. And the cool thing about this is when you cast it out and it hits the bottom, this slip sinker will actually ride up the line a little bit, leaving the stick bait to float, a little bit off of the bottom. And then when you pull the line, these two will come back together and then they will separate. But what's nice about this is the bass comes up to grab this. It's away from this weight, so that it grabs the top of this and you go to slam and set the hook, it goes into the fish's mouth without the weight in its mouth. It's often good to separate the weight from the bait because it gives the fish less chance of actually throwing that bait out of its mouth. There's a lot of different size slip sinkers. Just experiment around. I tend to go with the lightest weight I can possibly get away with and still make a decent cast. Some days if you're fishing deeper water or with bigger bait, you might want heavier sinkers like these Monster Bass tungsten weights. As you can see, this is a big old weight. I would throw this on a big tube where I might have to drive a bait down through some very thick vegetation or say lily pads. I don't often throw big weights like this, but hey, it helps to have some just in case you need them. This 5/16 or even a 1/4 ounce is about as big as I'll go on most soft plastics, but sometimes you need the big dogs. Alright, so as you can see here, there's quite a bit of difference between a 7-inch power worm and a 10-inch power worm. The 7-inch has got more of a curly tail, while the 10-inch is more straight. But for the 7-inch, I'm going to use this offset worm hook. Take it to the bend, pop it out, pull down, rotate, drop the eye of the hook in. So I'm going to kind of lay it where I want the hook to kind of come through the side. I'm just going to pull it up through like that so it stays straight. And that's what it looks like when the weight comes back down to the top of the worm. For our bigger worm, I'm going to use our extra wide gap hook. Now this big Mondo 10-inch worm might be something I throw like in a deep brush pile if I'm out in the boat. Or if I just want to make a really long cast and kind of hop it back to the bank. But bigger baits, they say, sometimes lead to bigger fish. One of the reasons why I like this straight chain hook with a Snell knot when I'm throwing it around, like say lay down trees and cover like that, the hook will run normally more or less in line with that sinker. So when I set the hook, it just kind of pulls everything that same way, right? See when I pull the line tight, how it's just, it's lined up with the sinker? Well, with the straight shank hook and a Snell knot, and I'm going to use this piece of paper instead of the palm of my hand, so that I don't inflict injury upon myself. So with this setup, when I use like creature baits and things like that I'm throwing around trees and whatnot. So watch the action when I set the hook, when this eye of the hook slams into the bottom of this sinker. It will snap and see that kicking action right there? That's what it's going to do in a bass's mouth. So when I lift my rod tip and slam it up, it will take and rotate that hook up. Don't matter which way I face it. It's going to move that hook to the side and drive it into the fish's mouth. Now that's really good if I'm pitching this into like a tree or something like that, where I need to set the hook quickly and drive this in here. And again, this is just an additional way of Texas rigging, you know, using a newer style hook that's more traditional. So for example, I will take our creature bait here, this bandito bug, and I will rig it the same way. Come out, take it, turn it. I'm going to drive all these keepers down into this bait. Just like that. And see here, you can see where it's holding it. And then I'm just going to poke this into the skin so it's just below the surface. Just like that. And then I'll take and pull these pinchers apart so that when it falls down into the water, these are all waving as they fall. Ah. So on a bait this small, I think this is like the 3-inch bandito bug. You can see this is more of a clear water bait. I'll use a real tiny sinker like this and toss this around laydowns and trees. And small ones like this with a small weight, it will fall, and it'll fall on a slack sinker. And, you know, it'd be a slow presentation as it comes down so that that bass can come up and grab it. All right, let's go. First cast. My brother caught a close to 3-pounder on his first cast. Are you serious? Yeah, my drag is not set enough. Dude, first cast. That bandito bug. First cast.
On my first cast, and JT did for his first.
If he can get it in the net. There we go.
Turn around so you guys can see this.
Hook me too.
Not quite as big as Jeremy's, but hey, that's a nice.
First fish on the bandito bug. Let's go. First fish on the Guggen Baits bandito bug. Hooked it right there in the corner of the mouth. First cast of the day. Now I could also throw something like this Hogwalla from 6 cents on this same setup for the same thing, a nice slow presentation. But if it's really thicker cover, what I would do is I would take one of these bobber stops and run it on the line before I put that sinker on. And most of the times, if I know I'm going to be tying a bait like this on, I'll put one of these on and I'll just slide it up the line a couple of feet and get it out of the way. If I find that I got to throw it into thicker stuff, I'll just slide this down the line back against this weight, and that would be our pegged presentation. So for example, the time that I would really do that, for example, would be a big tube bait like this. Great for catching smallies, and sometimes for catching largemouth bass who may have seen everything else forever and they're surprised by an old school bait like this. So you see how thick this bait is. Coming down, in, twist and bury. And I'm going to run this all the way through this hollow body tube. And again, make sure you put the bobber stop on beforehand, but as you can see, you just run it through the end of your line before you tie everything on. And as you can see, you can take your bobber stop and push it all the way down against that weight, and then it won't move. And that way, when you're throwing something like this big old tube into brush or around trees or lily pads, it keeps that weight against it. Or you can just slide it up the line, and you give some room so that when you make your cast and it hits the bottom, That sinker can be floating along the bottom while this tube or whatever is floating just above the bottom, again giving the fish something to grab without this weight. But if you're throwing it around lily pads or around laydowns and things like that, sometimes you want to have a pegged Texas rig. And it's just that easy. It's not really complicated. Again, if you want to keep it very simple, very basic, all you need is a spinning rod, pack of hooks, pack of sinkers, pack of 7-inch Berkley power worms. You'll catch a bass. In our next soft plastics video, we'll go over some more techniques. Hey, if you've already started fishing soft plastics, drop me a comment down below and tell me what's your favorite, and then tell me what's the biggest bass you caught on them. My personal best here in Indiana is 6.87 pounds. Caught on a rig that we'll talk about in video number 3. Now don't tell nobody, but one of my new favorites I got in my monster bass bag the last month. And I'm down to the last 2. Take these claws, dip them in a little of this in clear, slightly stained water. Oh my. Ooh. Until next time, go outside if you can and make a memory. They last a lifetime.